All right. So, okay, so now we're recording and it's my pleasure. I'm going to stop my share so Ben can put his slides up. I would like to introduce you to him and his program tonight. Well, you may not know, or maybe you do, but in the last 70 years, Mississippi kites have become one of the most abundant raptors in cities and towns throughout the Great Plains. And despite their ubiquity, I love that word, they're all around us, and their abundance, much of their life history and ecology awaits discovery. And in this presentation, Dr. Ben Skipper of Angelo State University is going to discuss his past and current research aimed at shedding light on this little studied raptor. And Dr. Ben, if you would put that on the regular presentation right now, I'm seeing the presenter mode. Yeah.
How about that?
Okay.
All right. Well, thank you for that introduction, Patsy. I'm honored to be here to speak with your Audubon group this evening about Mississippi kites. I'm especially tickled that there are so many people that are interested in hearing about this bird, who has sometimes been called a feathered rat by some colleagues of mine due to their sheer abundance in cities. I want to especially thank Becca Taylor for being persistent. I was probably not the best at emailing this past fall and spring, but she stuck with it. And so thanks to her for getting me in to speak with you guys tonight. I've entitled this Little Studied Kite on the Prairie because that's where most of the research on this bird has occurred. It's occurred in the southern Great Plains. And that's an odd thing when you think about the environmental history of this bird, which is one of the first things we're going to talk about here tonight. I've got a bit of an outline because I'm a teacher at heart, and I want you guys to know where we're going with this. We're going to talk about the environmental history of this bird, its distribution, changes to that distributions, losses and gains and colonizations along with that as well. We're going to look at a year in the life of a kite, filling in both information from my own research, but that from other researchers as well, and as we work our way around the calendar for these birds. And then finally, we're going to look at population trends and the outlook for this species, taking both a northern hemispheric and southern hemispheric perspective on them. All right. So let's talk about the environmental history of Mississippi kites. What do we mean by environmental history? Well, just that, their history as we look at environmental change right here. If we think about the North American landmass, sort of pre-Columbian discovery of North America, we can recognize that there were large and contiguous ecoregions present across the continent. Two of these ecoregions I want to call your attention to. These two are going to be here in the bolder colors. You're going to have the eastern deciduous forest that encompasses the southeastern United States, much of the Ohio River Valley as well, and up the eastern seaboard, just until you get into about the New England area. And then there's the Great Plains, that massive area of grass between the deciduous forest and the Rocky Mountains. If we think of those in sort of a pre-Columbian context, we can imagine that the eastern deciduous forest was mostly a contiguous area of large deciduous trees, and it was devoid of great expansive openings. Now, that's not entirely true. We certainly know that Native Americans cleared areas for farming. There were certainly fires, et cetera, et cetera. But compared to today, it was one large block of deciduous forest. And if we think of the Great Plains, again, in pre-Columbian times, we can imagine, well, the exact reverse. It was a large, expansive area of grasslands, and trees were few and far between, to say the very least, right here, right? From the standpoint of the Mississippi kite, what did this mean? Well, this meant that this bird that requires large standing trees for its nesting activities was going to be relegated to that eastern deciduous forest. And this shaded area that you can see upon the map shows what is thought to be the pre-Columbian distribution of Mississippi kites. And you can see these are a bird of mostly the southeastern states and the lower half of most of those southeastern states. It's thought that there were some kites that extended up the Mississippi and Ohio River valleys, but we don't think they were ever too abundant in those areas. And of course, this isn't coming to us from data gathered by what we would recognize as modern scientists, but instead is coming to us from the travel journals and notebooks of early explorers and travelers in these areas. Of course, as westward expansion continued by human populations, we ran out of forest as we entered into the Great Plains, and there we only see scattered accounts of Mississippi kites, mostly along river systems such as the Canadian River, which pours out of Texas into Oklahoma, and the Red River, which defines that north-south boundary between much of Texas and Oklahoma. Here, kites were most likely able to extend into the prairies because of narrow riparian forest of eastern cottonwood that extended far out along these riverine systems. So this is the distribution of Mississippi kites prior to the extensive colonization of North America by persons of European descent. But of course, that's not the distribution we see today. Many changes happened from this, let's just say 1500s through the 1900s and now the early 2000s. What we've seen happen with Mississippi kites is a great expansion into areas in the Great Plains, right? They've moved away from those riparian forests and have colonized areas that, at least in prehistory, were completely devoid of trees. Now, how were kites able to accomplish this? Well, they did it with our help. If we think about the landscape of the Great Plains today, it is still partly in prairie. It is mostly in row crop agriculture. But every now and again, you come across an area of human habitation where we've planted lots and lots of trees. And in planting lots of trees, we've made this area more suitable to kites, and they have responded with vigor. But we also saw deforestation occurring in the southeastern United States. And this is occurring in the early 1900s, maybe late 1800s as well, which of course reduced the available habitat for this species. So at the same time we think a population was expanding in the Great Plains, it was contracting in the southeastern states as well. We don't really know what was happening in East Texas, just not a lot of writings, not a lot of journals to go on from this area. So it's really anyone's guess how kites responded, whether they were holding static, declining, or increasing in this area. Today, and this is a late 1990s, early 2000s distribution map you're looking at here, kites have recovered in the southeastern states to a degree, but they've really established a new stronghold in the southern Great Plains of the United States. And by southern Great Plains, what I mean is mostly the panhandle of Texas, the big country of Texas, much of western Oklahoma, and they're now increasing in abundance throughout western Kansas, eastern Colorado, and eastern New Mexico as well. So this is a species that's experienced a tumultuous last 200 years, going from being the denizens of bottomland hardwood forest here in the southeastern United States, declining in that area, but colonizing and expanding in the southern Great Plains. And it's that southern Great Plains that I'm going to be speaking to you about for the remainder of our time together tonight. So let's jump into a year in the life of a Mississippi kite. Now, anytime you're jumping into an annual cycle, you've got to jump in somewhere, and we're going to jump in at the pre-laying period. This is the period of time that would correspond to late April and early May here in Texas, when kites are arriving on the breeding grounds from their wintering areas in South America. Right? It's an arbitrary decision to pick up here because you got to go start somewhere. So why not here? Right? One of the interesting things about Mississippi kites is they don't display a lot of breeding behaviors when they're here in the United States. For many other species of raptor, there's a pronounced and very visible period of courtship. You may have seen a red-tailed hawk or a golden eagle engaging in these roller coaster flights near their nesting area. And that is for males to attempt to attract a female to the nesting area. Kites don't do that. They seem to show up here with their pair bonds already formed. Now, that is a bit of an interpretation on what we're seeing. It could be that they engage in breeding behaviors, but these are just too subtle for us to notice, or too subtle for us to have noticed as of yet. Whatever the case, they appear to be here with their pair bonds already formed, and these courtship behaviors are rarely observed. One of the interesting things that we've been able to uncover about Mississippi kites, and we did this work out of Texas Tech University in Lubbock, Texas, is that mate fidelity appears to be very high. 75% of pairs remain together in subsequent years. This is a study that I did with Dr. Clint Boll of Texas Tech University. We captured kites and banded them year after year in Lubbock, Texas, and we waited for them to depart in the late summer and then arrive again in the early spring. And what we found was that they stuck together year after year. And even after I departed Texas Tech to move to Angelo State, Dr. Boll and his students continued to see these birds remaining together year after year. 4, 5, 6, 7 years together, these birds are coming back together. We never confirmed any cases of divorces, and divorce is something rarely mentioned in the avian world, but that is where a pair that was known to be together in a given year is separate in a subsequent year. And that may not seem like such a big thing to document, but what it requires is that you know where both of these individuals are, that they've both returned to the breeding area, but they've decided to part ways, at least as far as reproduction is concerned. One of the things we were also able to find out was that site fidelity was very high amongst these Mississippi kites, right? With 85% of individuals returning to the nesting area in subsequent years. And they, on average, they moved about 50 yards. The sort of greatest movement we had was about 150 yards right here, right? So I've got metric involved here. But meters and yards, that's roughly equivalent right here, right? So about 50 yards movement from year to year. And if you're like me and you have trouble locating your car after you exit the neighborhood HEB, it's pretty remarkable that these birds are able to come back and find the exact same nest tree and same nest within that tree year after year after year after year. This individual kite you can see here is one of our banded birds. That's Austin Teague, who is a technician of mine holding the bird. He works for New Mexico Game and Fish now. You'll notice the standard aluminum leg band here on the bird's right leg. That locks on so the bird can't remove it with their bill. And then over here on the left leg is this alphanumeric band, and we're able to read the letters on that band. This was BT right here, or boy toy, if you will, or ball toy. And that allows us to identify these individuals in subsequent days and subsequent years without the need to recapture them right here. This was a very famous bird on the Texas Tech campus, well known for attacking students who were just trying to make their way to their classes right here, right? So these leg bands here allowed us to measure both mate fidelity and site fidelity in these individuals. Right? Now, even if they're returning with the same mate to the same nesting area, there's often a period of nest building that needs to occur. And this may occur even if they're reusing the same nest from the previous year. This nest building behavior involves the male gathering sticks from the environment and generally bringing them to the female, who is sitting in the nesting area, oftentimes near where the nest will be constructed. One thing we learned anecdotally while studying these birds is the males are very vigorous in bringing sticks to the nesting area, and the females are very discriminating in deciding whether or not to use those sticks or not. Oftentimes underneath a nest that was actively being worked on, you would find a pile of discarded sticks whereby the male had brought something he thought was worthy of construction, and the female had tossed it aside, certainly knowing better what she needs to construct her nest with. I'm going to try to show you a video here of how we captured Mississippi kites, because it's a bit of a rodeo here. So let me try to explain what you're looking at here. We use a type of capture device known as a dogaza. I don't know the etymology of that word. I don't think anybody really does either right here, but the dogaza consists of large nets. Now, some of you may be familiar with mist nets, and these do operate in a similar fashion, except they break away when a bird encounters it. So what we do when we want to capture a Mississippi kite is we find a nesting area and we set up this dogaza. My setup here involved these poles. You can see one here. You might be able to see another one over here on the right-hand side. I'm not sure if my cursor is showing up or not for you guys. And there's a third pole here such that these nets are set up in a V formation right here. In between that, in the middle of that, we have a perch and we have a great horned owl that was loaned to us by the South Plains Wildlife Rehabilitation Center. This was an owl that was captured by some persons when it was very young. It was raised in an environment with close contact with humans. It imprinted on humans and could therefore never be released. It was used oftentimes for educational programs, but they were kind enough to let me borrow it for catching Mississippi kites. Now, why would an owl work to draw a kite in? Well, owls are the big bads of the avian world. They are well known to depredate the nest of small birds, of large birds, and including Mississippi kites as well. So just as you may have seen a northern mockingbird escort a house cat from your garden or your backyard, Mississippi kites will attempt to escort this owl from their nesting area. And in doing so, they fly into our net and we capture them, if all goes according to plan. So I'm going to hit play. This is very fast here, but you're going to see the kite come in from the left-hand side here. It wasn't the side I wanted this kite to come in from, but that's how working with animals can be. So you might see the owl's head moving, and there comes in the kite, and it's captured in this nest. Now, there's a lot of energy going on when the bird comes in, but I want to let you guys know that after about 80 captures of kites, I haven't had as much of a scratch get on any of them at all. It is a safe and frequently used method for capturing birds of prey at their nest. I've got one more video to show, I think. Oh, that's the same one. Here we go. This is at another park. Again, you can see our owl down here at the bottom, and you might be able to see the net poles hung up here as well. This one, you will also see a young ornithologist running in just as soon as the bird is caught. I believe that is myself, although 10 years can certainly change it quite a bit. So let's see what this looks like. You can hear grackles maybe being, saw the kite come in. It's really fast. There I am running. I'll play that one more time. Kite is attempting to make a low pass at the owl, and again, in doing so, it gets captured in our net right here. Just if anyone's wondering about the health and safety of the owl, that owl only had to go through 3 capture events in a given day, after which he was allowed to go back to his mew and rest up away from the hot sun. So we were certainly aware that the owl might not want to be out there during these capture events, and we certainly treated it accordingly. there. That was an essential part of my PhD research, capturing, banding, and following these kites from year after year. But of course, we followed other aspects of the kite's ecology using Lubbock, Texas as our home base. And one of the things we were most interested in was the habitat selection, right? This is a bird that's now living in a very artificial environment. What are the features of the landscape that it's interested in? And we compared our data from Lubbock, Texas to that of other studies that have been conducted, both in the Great Plains and some in that eastern deciduous forest right in here. And what we found is there's some consistencies, but also lots of inconsistencies as well. Amongst eastern populations, those that are breeding in what we could consider the native or natural range of kites, there tends to be selection for large, mature forest tracts with nest trees that are generally larger than any unselected trees. Basically, kites want a big patch of forest and they want the biggest tree within that patch of forest. However, out here in the Great Plains, well, there's really no selection when it comes to the shelter belts that may be used. And this is one of the first habitats that kites were noted as nesting in. These are the trees that are planted for protection against the prairie winds that come in. They're planted mostly for soil conservation purposes. And kites will use large ones, kites will use small ones, kites will use isolated trees, kites will use large clumps of trees. They really don't show any preference for the size of that shelter belt. However, they do show selection for the largest and maturest trees that are within them. So they really don't care about the patch size. They just want the biggest tree overall right here. Right? A similar thing is noted along western rivers. Kites have recently begun expanding into the Rio Grande Valley of New Mexico and into the San Pedro River area of Arizona. And there, that similar trait of always selecting for the largest tree around still holds sway. If we look at urban areas, we look at the cities here in the Great Plains where kites are nesting right in here, they're typically going to use deciduous trees, and especially those that are most frequently encountered. Here in Texas and in Oklahoma and Kansas, these are species of pecan, species of elm, and species of locust as well, mostly honey locust and black locust being used. Typically, as we see in the exurban or the rural environments, it is the largest trees that are used here as well. So they're looking for a very sturdy platform into which to place their nests. And of course, this makes sense if you think about spring and summer in the Great Plains, lots and lots of wind which could potentially lead to trees swaying back and forth and eggs or young being dislodged from the nest. But there's little else that's predictive of where kites will place their nest in urban settings. They don't necessarily place them further away from buildings or parking lots or tennis courts than we might have expected. No, indeed, they can be found right over those parking areas or directly over an athletic field or squeezed up next to a building or a high traffic area. They seem to be really keying on the tree itself and not really paying any attention to anything else that's around them. This work came after measuring hundreds of trees within the panhandle of Texas, and it was a big surprise to myself and my advisor that they really didn't seem to care about anything else other than the tree they were going to place that nest in. One of the remarkable things that kites do in the southern Great Plains, especially in urban areas, is they achieve nesting densities unheard of in the raptor world. This image on the right-hand side shows a golf course in Lubbock, Texas, and each of those red dots was an active pair of nesting Mississippi kites in the year 2010. Right? Nest would be as close as about 110 meters from one another. So again, 110 yards. And if you think about this and you counted all of those red dots, simply multiply by 2, and that's the number of adult kites you have occupying this 18-hole golf course. They are incredibly dense in these urban areas, with some city parks the size of a quarter of a city block having up to five nesting pairs squeezed into this small area. And that's unheard of amongst raptors. One of the reasons it's unheard of amongst raptors is most raptors are looking to the ground to find the food that they are going to feed on. This is true of large bootios like red-tailed hawks or Swainson's hawks. And we could even extend that out for things like sharp-shinned hawks and Cooper's hawks, who, though they're catching prey that flies in the air, that prey itself is tied to shrubs and grassland and small trees as well. Kites aren't looking to the ground for what they're feeding on. Instead, they're looking to the sky, and we believe this is what allows them to achieve these high nesting densities. And that's what I mean about a product of prey predictability. So let's move on. I'll come back to that in just a second here, but let's get some eggs in the nest right in here and talk about laying of eggs, clutch size, and incubation behaviors here. All right. Egg laying seems to begin shortly after completion of the nest. This is generally going to be in mid-May in most regions of Texas. It will be later as you move further north. So for the few nesting pairs of kites that are now in Nebraska, we're probably talking the first or second week of June for them to be laying their eggs. For most kites, 2 eggs is the norm, right? We did not assess clutch size in our population in Lubbock, Texas, because we were afraid of creating these problem kites that defend their nest vigorously. But elsewhere where this has been studied, Jim Parker, who was an early researcher in Kansas, checked about 300 nests, and I think about 298 of them had just 2 eggs. The exception to that 2-egg rule is the 3-egg nest right in here, and that is exceedingly rare. We don't know if that is a single female producing all 3 eggs, or perhaps, and I don't have any data to back this up, but a case of conspecific brood parasitism, where another Mississippi kite lays her egg in the nest of someone else. Either one of those are possible ones right in there to help explain 3 eggs. But whatever the case, 2 eggs are the norm. 3 eggs is pretty rare. We don't have any data on the laying rate, that is to say how frequently eggs are produced. They certainly aren't produced on consecutive days. The diet of kites is simply too nutritionally poor, and the eggs too large for the female's body mass for her to be laying an egg on Tuesday and then another egg on Wednesday, right in here. But our data, when looking at the age of nestlings that have grown up in those nests, suggests that there's a pretty wide disparity, with some females perhaps laying eggs every other day or perhaps every 3 days, and other kites perhaps laying the first egg and the second egg up to 2 weeks apart. Again, it's an area that needs a little more investigation. This is one of those little studied aspects of this species. So there does seem to be a lot of variability with how the eggs are laid. Incubation, though, does begin with the very first egg that is laid. What that means is where we have a female who lays an egg and then 7 or 10 or 14 days later lays another egg, we're going to see a great disparity in the size of those nestlings. And sometimes in late July, you will see one nestling is flexing its wings, getting ready for its first flight, and the other nestling can barely hold its head up. There's a great disparity in the ages of these nestlings right in here. If we move into that nestling period and talk about reproductive success, this is an area where we do have quite a bit of data because it has been the focus of a large number of research projects right in here. Right. Nestlings remain with or within the nest for up to 28 days after they hatch. At that time, like any other raptor species, they're completely helpless and dependent upon their parents for food and protection from the elements. This, of course, includes in the Great Plains Heavy thunderstorms, hailstorms, strong winds, and as we're experiencing this year, intense sunlight and very high temperatures. And parents do spend a lot of time in the early nestling period guarding their young from the environmental elements that are out there. Provisioning of young is one of the better studied aspects of kite ecology as well. This has been studied both in eastern populations, Great Plains populations, and western populations right in here. And what has come out of this is that kites are adaptable and opportunistic foragers. While they're oftentimes described as being insectivorous, that doesn't quite capture the full range of foraging behaviors that these birds can engage in. Birds in Arkansas, with a team led by Dr. Jim Bednarz, these Mississippi kites preyed heavily upon lizards and on frogs. They also supplemented their diet with dragonflies, and that was contingent upon how flooded the forests were around them. When the forests were flooded, these are bottomland hardwood forests along the White River, and dragonflies were abundant, kites took advantage of that, and they fed heavily upon these dragonflies. In other years, drought years where the forests were not flooded and dragonflies were not so abundant, they switched over to vertebrate prey. A similar thing was seen in the Great Plains in a study done by Ms. Brandy Welch. She found that in years of typical rainfall, Mississippi kites fed their young primarily cicadas and dragonflies. However, during the drought year of 2011, when dragonflies and cicadas were hard to come by, kites picked up a greater variety of vertebrate prey, songbirds, small mammals, and reptiles to feed to their young as well. So even though they're characterized as being insectivorous, they oftentimes do prey heavily on vertebrate prey. One of the food items, though, that is important no matter where kites can be found are cicadas, right? These are the annual cicadas that are probably buzzing just outside of your windows right now. And these seem to be a really important prey items for kites and are thought to drive some aspects of their natural history. That high nesting density that I showed you just a few slides ago is really thought to stem from the abundance of cicadas. Cicadas, of course, are gestating underground and then emerging in the late spring and early summer. And then, of course, their populations are moving about the areas where they're attempting to mate. They're unpredictable. And because the prey is unpredictable, kites really have no need to get aggressive towards one another when it comes to their territories. After all, what are you defending, right? There's no prey associated with this. All of those cicadas are high in the sky when we're going to be feeding on them. So in fact, kites achieve this nesting density and this foraging modality in a way that is much more like colonial seabirds than other birds of prey. They're really tolerant of one another because the prey is just somewhere out there and we've got to go find it every single day. Reproductive success, like provisioning of young, is also well studied in kites as well. The comparisons between urban and rural populations suggest something that has been called an urban advantage. This phrase was coined by Dr. Fred Gelbach of Baylor University during his long-term studies of eastern screech owls there in Waco. And what we see when we look at this urban advantage is that urban nests tend to do better than their exurban counterparts, right? So amongst exurban studies, these are again outside of the city, we see an annual success rate between 14 and 61%. That's across 8 studies that have been conducted. In the urban environment, we see an annual nesting success rate of 33 to 100%. That's across 4 studies right in here. And when you're comparing rural to urban in a given year, the urban environment always does better. So there's something about nesting in a city that really benefits these Mississippi kites. The nest are simply more successful. Now, there's a number of hypotheses that have been put forward. There's little data to support any of them. That doesn't mean that there's no data out there. It's just we haven't gone and looked for it. But generally, it's thought that a simpler predator community is fostering this in part. But there's also this idea of something called the urban heat island. And this is where that dome of warm air builds up over our cities. And you may have seen this when watching the radar. A thunderstorm is approaching the city and it tends to split and go around it right in here. That is partly attributed to this urban heat island. And of course, that, while preventing any rainfall from falling in the city, also prevents high winds and large hailstones from falling on nesting Mississippi kites. And so that's been argued as one of the reasons why they do better in cities as well. Heat and drought, though, do have pronounced negative effects on the reproductive success of kites right here. I was fortunate or unfortunate enough to be studying these birds in 2011. Of course, 2011 was, up until date, probably the most pronounced drought that many of us have experienced in our lifetimes. That is where we saw the lowest reproductive success in any year that I was monitoring Mississippi kites. Nests were failing left and right, eggs weren't hatching, young were dying on the nest as well. Of course, we are bound to see that again this year unless things change dramatically and very quickly as well. This, of course, the effects of drought and extreme heat can be felt across the urban and rural environments. But again, there is an urban advantage, and birds in the city seem to weather this a little bit better than birds outside of the city. Now, one of the things kites are best known for is defense of the nest site right here. And this is a very dated photograph here, but it is one that maybe some of you can sort of relate to a little bit. Someone trying to go about their day-to-day life in an urban environment, and they better get ready because a Mississippi kite has got them in its crosshairs right here. It's well known, but its causes are poorly understood, right? We know what triggers these events is that a pedestrian or something like a pedestrian ventures too close to the nesting area, and a kite or kites make these low repeated swoops near the pedestrian's head in an effort to escort them from the nesting area, right? This is typically how this occurs, well known to happen on golf courses, as the previous photo showed you, and around walking trails in city parks as well. These cases tend to create a reputation for Mississippi kites. This is especially true in my experience on golf courses, where even though only one or two kites may engage in these aggressive behaviors, one bad apple spoils the bunch, or at least spoils things for the bunch, and people tend to project that singular bad experience onto the population as a whole right in here. Right? Our studies that we conducted both in 2009 through 2014 and most recently in the last 2 years have shown that this aggressive nest defense is much, much less than people generally perceive. These are some of the signs we erected around Lubbock, Texas, in an attempt to educate persons about what was going on. It was our perception that if people knew why these birds were defending their nest, they might be less likely to get, or they might be less likely to get upset at those birds. After all, we all want to defend what is ours right in here. What we did was we sent a model pedestrian near the nest of Mississippi kites. We did this in a remote urban area, that's the blue color, an exurban park, that's this teal color, and then an urban environment, that is this sort of olive green color right in here. We scored the behavior of Mississippi kites as: did they flush from the nest? Did they remain incubating the nest? Did they leave the nest and circle and call overhead? or did they dive at individuals in an attempt to drive them from the nesting area? What you can see here is that the diving behavior was rare in all three environments. There are some kites that are just not going to tolerate you near their nesting area. That's true whether they're nesting in Dallas, Texas, or in some of the most remote regions of the big country of Texas here. If we looked at these behaviors of remain seated at the nest, as you can see, most urban birds did not care whatsoever that a pedestrian passed directly underneath their nest. They remained incubating at the nest and simply watched the pedestrian as it passed by. That was also true somewhat of our ex-urban park. This was actually Palo Duro Canyon. It is definitely an ex-urban environment, but sees lots and lots of hikers throughout the spring and summer months here. And we attribute the display of this behavior to a high degree due to those birds' familiarity with pedestrians. They realize that humans are not a threat to their nest or their nest's contents, and they simply don't mind us being there right here. On the other hand, those birds in these remote ex-urban environments, this was Matador Wildlife Management Area near Paducah, Texas, they're very unfamiliar with pedestrians being near their nest, and that caused them to flush just a little bit over 50% of the time when the pedestrian approached their nest. So the response of these kites to disturbance by a human really does tend to correlate very well with their experience with humans near the nest. So what we found in this study was human activity levels, an inconsistent predictor of nest defense, right in here. Both urban and ex-urban kites may vigorously defend their nest sites, but always a low proportion are doing so. One thing I didn't show you any data for, but you can take my word for it right in here, habitat features were not predictive of nest defense. Kites that are nesting in the tops of tall trees were just as likely to take a swoop at your head as those that were nesting in small shrubs. There was really nothing about the habitat that was predictive of this aggressive nest defense. I'm going to move rather quickly through the migratory period right in here. I want to talk just a little bit about the timing. This is one area where we lack a lot of information. Right in here, and that is largely because there is a bit of a cost associated with studying migration in birds. Mississippi kites are classic neotropical migrants right in here. They do cross between the near Arctic here in the United States and Canada and the neotropics here in South America. They completely vacate, or at least that has been the historical norm, for them to completely vacate North America during the non-breeding season. Their migratory path is like that of many other neotropical migrants as they fly down the Gulf Coast of Mexico through Central America and then into South America, where we know very, very little that is occurring there, right? Again, as I was saying, we need individual level migration data desperately on these birds, right? We don't know the speed of their migration. We don't really know the migratory paths. I mean, think of how broad it is to say Central America to South America, and that's all the detail we can provide. That's not very good right here. At the population level, it's suggested that these birds move together, right? Late summer, early fall in Texas, it's not uncommon to see flocks of 1,000+ kites gathering along the Texas coast as they're making their way south. By the time they pass through Veracruz, Mexico, and if you haven't had a chance to see that migration, I highly recommend it. We're talking 70,000 to maybe 80,000 birds passing overhead each and every day. In 2020, 300,000 kites passed over Veracruz, Mexico. It's a river of raptors down there, and I strongly encourage you to see it. In Texas, we do see that last seen dates, these are the last observations from eBird. They do tend to vary with latitude right here. I've broken up all the observations by latitude here. These are the latitudinal bands you can see here. And at latitude 36 up in the Panhandle, last seen dates are sometimes between mid to August to mid-September. Here in the center, mid-September to mid-October. And then down here in the lower Rio Grande Valley, kites may be hanging around as late as mid-October right here. Over the last 10 years, across these three latitudinal bands, there has been an increase in the last seen dates, meaning that kites are seen later and later into the year as each year goes by. What this could be, I'm uncertain of just yet. It could be that kites are sticking around a little bit longer as our climate is becoming more and more amenable to them. Or it could be more northerly populations, those in Nebraska and Colorado, being just a little bit late as they make their migrations down south. Overwintering is the black box when it comes to Mississippi kites. We know very, very little right in here. Well, that's true for a lot of neotropical migrants right in here. The best available evidence suggests that they are overwintering within the Chaco forest of Argentina, Paraguay, and Uruguay. This is an area about 1.4 million square kilometers, and you can see here highlighted in blue. This winter range comes to us from just a scant few observations right here. And so while it is the best available evidence, it is certainly something that could be built upon in future years. Here's another look at what that range consists of right in here. This bar chart simply shows you the breakdown in terms of percentage of habitat. You'll notice the humid and dry Chacos. These are open forest or woodlands, as you and I would call them. They are the predominant habitats, as are the Uruguayan savannas as well. So their wintering habitat is not at all like that southeastern deciduous forest. It's much more like the savannas and shrublands that we have here in Texas. That's where they're spending their winters, again, to the best of our knowledge right here. Again, here on the wintering grounds, just a few studies to draw on. It appears that kites are gregarious and social on the wintering grounds, generally traveling in flocks of 100 or more birds as they go about their day-to-day lives. But again, not much known from this area. Northbound migration, just like southbound, we know very little right in here. And I'm simply going to show you the progression from eBird as we move from January through the breeding months. This is showing you where the majority of sighted birds can be found. Notice it is mostly still in that South American distribution. A few birds in Central America right in here could be misidentified plumbeous kites, but we just don't know that. By February, the distribution remains mostly the same, but by March, you can see these birds have made their invasion into North America, especially here in Texas and Louisiana. By April, they're mostly occupying their breeding range, and the same holds true into May and June as well, right? So these are birds that are largely moving into the United States sometime between mid-February and mid-March, and are really expanding out into their breeding range by April and May. I've got one last thing. I know I'm running a bit late right here, but this is sort of hot off the presses of a student of mine, and I want to share it, what she's been able to put together right in here. And it has to do with the population structure of Mississippi kites right here. If we look, and this is just a chart from eBird, many of you will recognize this right in here. At the landscape level, when we look at the kites, well, they seem to have a continuous population, right? The purple is all over here from eastern New Mexico all the way over to Georgia and South Carolina. But if we take a closer look at the southern Great Plains, we'll notice that it is not a continuous breeding habitat, right? Kites are more disjunct on the landscape, and there are wide spaces throughout the southern Great Plains where we don't find any Mississippi kites whatsoever, right? This is an area from southeastern Colorado and western Kansas right in here. And you'll notice here along the Canadian River, large numbers of kites can be found right in here. And then they're dotted throughout here. Now, what's causing this distribution? Well, it's the landscape that they're living in right here. This is Amarillo, Texas, right here, right? At least the top picture is what the Chamber of Commerce would like to sell you on if you're thinking about moving to Amarillo, Texas. Nice green lawns, tall green trees to be found out there. Of course, if you turn around 180 degrees and you look at the landscape outside of Amarillo, Texas, you'll find this short grass prairie, absolutely devoid of those trees. Same could be said of Lubbock, Texas, Clovis, New Mexico, Dodge City, Kansas, Great Bend, Kansas, Pueblo, Colorado, all of these cities throughout the Southern Great Plains right here, right? Lots and lots of trees in the city, not so much outside of the city right here. This is my former student, Brittany Lofton. She's now at Boise State University studying goshawks right in here. And she hypothesized this landscape configuration of trees in the city and an absence of trees outside of the city would render this habitat in the Southern Great Plains as a series of islands, if you would, right? Remember, kites require tall nesting trees in order to complete their reproduction. And you've got tall nesting trees in a few of these areas I'm indicating, but you don't have these tall nesting trees outside of those areas. And Brittany hypothesized that this would lead to a fine scale genetic structure across the landscape, with birds in Lubbock being genetically distinct from those in Roswell, which would also be genetically distinct from those up in Tucumcari, and which would be genetically distinct from those from Amarillo. Because after all, if you need a tall, large tree to nest, the area between Amarillo and Lubbock, well, it's not exactly the best place for you right here. To answer this question, Brittany and I traveled throughout the Southern Great Plains. Each of those blue dots on this map represents an area where Brittany and I traveled to capture and sample Mississippi kites. Now, I want to go ahead and warn you, if you're planning to do something like this for yourself, you want to go ahead and run it by your spouse that you're not going to be available 2 summers in a row, because this is a lot of driving and a lot of visits to small towns throughout the Great Plains to capture those kites and sample tissues from them for genetic materials. We had a little bit of help. The red dots mark wildlife rehabilitators who were able to provide us with tissues from kites that were admitted to their facilities but did not survive treatment in those areas, right? So all of these represent genetic samples that Brittany was able to gather. And I'm going to sort of go ahead and do the magic part right here. There was lots of lab work and analysis that I'm not going to pretend to fully understand that Brittany was capable to do in order to answer this question. And the big drum roll sort of reveal here is, well, there's absolutely no genetic structure in the Southern Great Plains. Right. Each of these colored dots gathered here by the rectangles show birds from given states. So the red dots are birds from Colorado, the purple dots are birds from Texas, the blue dots are birds from Kansas, the green dots are birds from New Mexico right in here. And what you can see is those dots completely overlap with one another. And the way to interpret this plot is there's not fine scale genetic structure. Birds in Abilene, Texas are genetically identical to those in Abilene, Kansas. Birds in Lubbock, Texas are genetically identical to birds in Lamar, Colorado. And birds from Hobbs, New Mexico are genetically identical to those occurring in the furthest northeast of the distribution in the Great Plains. This was kind of surprising because remember, long ago, I told you that Mississippi kites have this high site fidelity. They come back to the same spot year after year after year. So what's going on with this? Who's in contact amongst all these different populations? Well, we suspect it's these guys. Right? We suspect it's these guys which are the juvenile kites. And much like juveniles from many other species, they tend to get lost or they tend to wander from place to place. And that's the next topic of our research, a partnership between Angelo State University and Texas Tech University to find out how these juveniles are moving across the landscape. And hopefully you'll have me back in a few years to discuss what's going on with these juvenile kites. Now, I've run a bit long and I apologize for that right here. Becca, Patsy, right now, if there are any questions from the audience, I'd be happy to answer them at this time or go into further depth on any subject that I've touched on here tonight.
Wow. That was great. I was hanging on that explanation of the genetic diversity, and I was making my own hypothesis, and there's the picture of it right there, those little juvies. That's very interesting. That will be interesting to find out what they're doing. I just made a comment in this chat. The male stick delivery is a form of courtship in great blue herons. Is that, does a female ever reject a male because he doesn't bring good sticks or anything like that?
We haven't seen that, and I don't want to make excuses, right? I'm a teacher, so I hear plenty of excuses right here. But it is a challenging thing to study. When I think about each bird we captured, each one of those individuals represents probably 12 hours worth of work. It takes time to capture these. And so we're working with a very limited sample size. And we've never seen that case where a pair tended to be together, started building the nest, and then the female rejects him outright. That case has never been seen. You're right that in many species of birds, the gathering of nest materials does count for courtship behavior. Right there. When I said that there was an absence of this, what I mean is that one day when we're searching for nests, there'll be no kites in a known nest tree. And the next morning, both male and female are sitting right next to each other. So they seem to be ready to pair up, or it doesn't take much at all for them to pair back together when they arrive here. Now, gathering those nest materials certainly can strengthen that pair bond between the two of them right there, but they don't go through these elaborate courtship flights as we see in some other raptors.
Yeah, it could be that once you get some data, some people looking at them when they're on their wintering grounds, that you might see that happening over that Chaco forest. They may do that before they get there.
It is. So there's one of the hypotheses that has come up is that they're perhaps staying together during the non-breeding season, maybe migrating together. That would be pretty odd. Not many birds are known to do that, but they could be forming those pair bonds as they migrate up. And the challenge is getting both males and females with a tracking device on them and seeing how they move. And of course, that is, it's an expensive technology to use. Costs have come down, but hopefully there's some of that RAWA funding to come this way in the next few years. Got to get it passed first. But
thanks for kicking that in. We have a note from Britt saying, let's cover up our senators with emails and voicemails in support of RAWA, because that's what we can find out. So, this expansion into the Great Plains is really relatively recent too. And that genetic stuff may not have happened yet.
Well, so that is a good point. The genetic technology we're using is something called a single nucleotide polymorphism. And that's a mouthful, but it represents a single change in the A, C, T, and G genetic code. And these actually happen with every generation. And they're heritable from parent to offspring as well. And so while you're right, we're probably not going to see a morphological difference between eastern populations and Great Plains. There have been other studies with other species, not just birds, that have picked up that genetic change in a much shorter time frame. So for kites, we're really looking at 60 to 70 years since they became really abundant in the Great Plains. There's some data that they were maybe in Paladero Canyon in the 19 teens, but those are few individuals. So I'm thinking it's possible there could not have been enough time, but it's also really possible that these young birds are moving around a great deal and, of course, causing that mixing to occur. I saw one question. I didn't mean to cut you off. I'm sorry.
No. Go ahead.
About do the kites harass the golfers? Do the golfers say they harass them? Yeah. Do they really? Well, the kite's not following them around the golf course. They're only defending their specific territorial area. So, one or two swoops, I don't know if that would meet the level of harassment, but I haven't I don't golf. I do know it can be an expensive sport, and so if you've paid $200 to hit a golf ball, it might constitute harassment for you.
Depends on your definition.
Yeah, there's an interesting sociological question there too. Do the golfers at the municipal golf course, where it costs $10, consider it a harassment versus those at the the country club where it's a little more expensive?
Do the kites consider it harassment?
Do the kites consider harassment?
Well, it's so they will. How to put this? Most of the time, if you just walk by, they don't do anything. And the way I like to think of this is we all live in residential areas, or maybe we don't, but many of us do. And we have people on sidewalks that walk by our homes all the time. We're used to that. What we're not used to is when someone stops in front of our home. And that is when, oh gosh, they're going to try to sell me something. We start getting a little more concerned. And what we found, I didn't speak on it here tonight, is that for many kites, if you just keep walking, they're going to let you go. But when you stop, well, that ratchets up the threat level a little bit. And if you think about what golf is, it's traveling and stopping. And so many golfers will get their colleague to hold up a driver with a hat on it. Kites are going to swoop at the tallest thing out there. So it won't be the golfer's head. It will just be that decoy that they put up. I've talked to a lot of golfers. Some of them, they're the worst things in the world. They should all be shot. Others, a little more easygoing, play it as it lies. So it could be a sand trap. It could be the rough, and it could be that darned bird over by hole 13. There's a variety of opinions, as there always is.
Well, we have a comment from one of people who says that I volunteer at the Corpus Christi, Gene. I volunteer at the Corpus Christi Hawk Watch, and now I have a better understanding. They are really different in many ways from the average raptor, as you pointed out, and that makes them really special.
Is that at the Gene? Is that at the and I always get the name wrong? The Hazel Baysmore. Yeah, I always, that's always our place to get green jays when I take students down. But I always see the hawk count there in the late spring, and oftentimes we're a bit too early for the kites to really have moved through in grand numbers there. But many of them, probably 90% of the continental population are going to pass within 20 miles of the Texas Gulf Coast. That is the funnel for raptors coming up. And so I have seen counts down there of the tens of thousands of Mississippi kites moving over. It's impressive.
Well, we have a comment from Becca. Becca, you want to say something? She writes, such beautiful and fascinating birds. Thanks so much for sharing your research and knowledge. Would love to have you come back. And we may even invade you over there in San Angelo one of these days, we might put together an extended outing where we would come in, because one thing I didn't mention is that Ben is, along with his teaching duties and all of his research and driving all over West Texas and all that, he's the curator of birds in the Angelo State Natural History Collection. And he also nets and bands sparrows and does a lot of different research. It's not just Mississippi kites. He's a busy guy.
Well, if I can for just a moment, Patsy, I've got one or two more slides I'd like to share, and I think the RAWA funding is a good segue here.
Okay.
One of the things that the challenges that ornithologists and other zoologists face here is that our model for funding research has been to fund those species, and this is not I'm not criticizing anyone. It's just the way things have worked out. We fund those species that generate revenue. So we have good funding for quail. We have good funding for white-tailed deer and these species like this, where there is a consumptive use by the public. And then we fund things as they're circling the drain. And I mean that towards extinction and extirpation. We don't fund those animals in the middle. Right. And that has been our model of funding here in the United States for as long as I've been paying attention right here. RAWA could change that. And the reason that's important, and I'm as interested in it passing as everyone else, is that birds that are secure today in their population may not be secure tomorrow. All right. I'm going to advance a couple of slides here. And talk just a little bit about Mississippi kites right in here. Right? This is one of the top 10, the most abundant birds of prey in North America, easily top 10, maybe top 5 right in here. Right? And that numerical abundance has suggested security to many persons right in here. This is Jim Parker, who's one of the main kite researchers. He's no longer active, but he did a lot of early work right in there. He said that Mississippi kites are secure right in here due to their acceptance of planted trees in the West and Great Plains. Well, let's evaluate that statement from 1999. The truth is, many of the trees they're using are introduced species nearing their lifespans. Siberian and Russian elms were extensively planted throughout the Great Plains during the period of the Great Depression and the decade before and after. These trees live about 100 years. It means in the years 2020 to 2030, many of these trees are dying. Many of them are being removed. And as we humans have a tendency to do, we don't plant a new tree until the old tree is gone. Right in here. And this is a picture from the campus of Eastern New Mexico University, a campus that once hosted many pairs of Mississippi kites. It hosts one today because these trees, they're a public safety concern. The limbs can fall and injure people. If I'm an administrator, I'm trimming that old ugly tree right here. Development continues in many Great Plains cities. When I first arrived on the campus of Texas Tech University, 15 nesting pairs on campus alone. Today, there are around 2 or 3 nesting pairs. And that's because green spaces and parks have given way to parking lots and new buildings right here. This is the habitat that Parker considered secure. All of this existence in the Great Plains is due to water. Right? I mean, we forget the only reason where people are able to live in the numbers they do in Lubbock, Texas, in Eastern New Mexico, in the Great Plains of Kansas, in large cities of 100,000 or more people is because of available water. Well, any map of the Ogallala and other aquifers in this region will show you that water is running out, and it's running out rapidly. What happens when water becomes so scarce and becomes so expensive that these golf courses where kites breed abundantly can no longer prop these trees up with unnatural amounts of water? Those trees die, that nesting habitat is lost in that area, right? Eastern populations are thought to be more secure, but are they right here? right? One of the major concerns amongst ornithologists working with forest birds is the increase in demand in fuel pellets. These are the compressed wood fibers that are used to heat homes and stoves and things like this. This demand has increased dramatically, and the forests that are being felled for that, large numbers of that is coming from the southeastern United States. Part of the breeding range of kites that was formerly occupied, cut back, now reoccupied, and is potentially being cut back to fill this demand. If we look in the southern hemisphere, all the attention goes to the Amazon rainforest, and rightfully so. What is happening there is a crime against humanity and nature right in there. But this dry Chaco forest is one of the areas experiencing pronounced forest loss. This is the millions of square kilometers being lost year after year, 300, 400, 700, 800, right? Here it is in the dry Chaco. Here it is in that Uruguayan savanna. These three areas constitute about 75% of the wintering range of Mississippi kites. And so though we have one of the most abundant raptors in the Mississippi kites, its foundation is a bit precarious, right? I don't mean to be an alarmist here, but it is a bit precarious when you're seeing the wintering range be decimated and potentially big changes coming to their breeding range as well. This is the area of that dry Chaco. Here's the desert here. You can see the rain shadow pretty clearly. This is 18 December 2000. Here's that same area 19 years later right in here. And you can see the amount of forest that has been lost. And recall, this is not a large area to begin with. This is an animation showing you those Landsat photos, and you can see the creeping deforestation from both sides, east and west, squeezing this dry Chaco out of existence right in here, right? So there's an imperative to understand what's really happening down in South America, right? Is it as bad as I maybe have led it on to be, or maybe not? We're only going to answer that question if we're able to follow these birds down to their breeding areas. And this is where RAWA comes back into focus, because the amounts of money that are being promised underneath this new legislation would afford funding to study this in this, what is today a very abundant bird, but tomorrow could have gone the way of some of our other bird species that have experienced pronounced declines. And again, I'm not an alarmist by nature right here, but the facts are the facts, that these birds, their habitat is imperiled on both ends of their migration. So do call your senators right there, encourage them to vote for this. We need it desperately, not only for these birds, but for all of the other wildlife out there that is been needing attention for a very long time.
Thank you for that. We appreciate that support. We're going to support you back. And we do encourage everyone, now is the time, if you've never called your senator's office or written your senator or emailed, this is the time to do it. So all you have to do is say, I'm for it. And they do listen to us. It doesn't take very many people contacting them to make an impact. And now is the time to do that. So Ben, thank you so much. It was fascinating. We've got so many nice comments. I'll send you the chat so you can read them all. And we would like you to come back, be part of our family, come back and talk to us again. Whenever you want to do that, just let us know. You'd be welcome. So
go ahead. Well, thanks for having me. It's always fun to chat about these birds, even though I don't currently have any research with them right now. Every time I kind of get going, I kind of think, why not? Why not doing more with them? Because they are fascinating, and there's a lot we can still learn about them.
So every time you look up and see a Mississippi kite overhead, think about all this. And thank you very much for the bonus content at the end. That was really important. Fantastic information, nice, lovely comments. We'll send all those to you, and I'll send you a link to the recording so that you'll have that in your scrapbook.
Well, that'll be great.
Okay, well, everybody, thank you. Thank you very much for being with us tonight and learning about these wonderful creatures. And get busy and contact your senator, our senators, I should say. So we will sign off for tonight, and thank you very much for spending your time with us, all of you, and especially to you, Dr. If we can call you Dr. Ben.
No, just Ben's fine.
Just Ben's fine. Okay, so everybody try to stay cool, stay hydrated, get out early to see the birds, and know that they are all depending on us. So see you all. Signing off for
Guys,
now.
have a great night.
Thank you.
Night, night.
Thank you, Pat.